Hello, and welcome to the holiday edition of Fire Away, Rudner Law's online employment law show discussing the employment law issues that matter to you. My name is Stuart Rudner. I'm an employment lawyer and mediator and your host of Fire Away. Just a reminder that Fire Away streams online every month, and episodes are always available on our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and of course on our website. If you are watching live, we'd be happy to take your questions, so feel free to comment on Facebook or YouTube or tweet to us at Rudner Law. Today, for our last episode of 2019, we're lucky to have two guests. The first one is Lisa Kay. Lisa is the president and lead consultant of Peak Performance HR. And I'm also lucky enough to be joined by Brian Daly. Brian is the president and CEO of Brian Daly and Associates Inc. So today, as you may have guessed from the hat, we'll be discussing holidays in the workplace and all of the issues, risks, and challenges facing employers at this time of year. It's the most wonderful time of the year, as we often say, but it can get very complicated, starting with what do we even call this time of year? And even in our pre-show discussions, we had one person refer to it as Christmas and then quickly correct that to say the holidays. So we can't even agree on what we call this season, and people often get upset when you say the holidays and feel as though it's just the politically correct way to say Christmas. So there's often some emotion that arises, but we're going to talk today with Brian and Lisa about how you deal with holidays in the workplace, making sure it's inclusive, respectful, trying to make sure you don't have issues where you have a holiday party that is really Christmas in all but name, or other inclusivity fails that we have seen over the years. And we haven't even talked about the holiday party yet. So I know a lot of companies have moved away from having one at all because they were so scared about potential liability for things like sexual harassment, drinking and driving, or just could not figure out how to make it an inclusive celebration as opposed to the Christmas party they've always had. So that's definitely not the best result if people just decide to scrap the holidays altogether. And Brian and Lisa both have a wealth of experience of dealing with these issues amongst many others in the world of HR. So we want to talk to them and get their ideas on best practices. So Brian and Lisa, first of all, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, hi, Stuart. How are you?
I am great. Very excited about this. My head's getting a little warm in the hat, so it may not last all half hour, but
but it looks great.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's great for covering up the parts that don't have as much hair as the other parts. So I might actually start wearing this all year round. So let me start with a very general question. I've talked about some of the issues that arise in the holiday times. I've written about this. I've been interviewed about this many times. What would you guys say are your top tips for ensuring that the holidays can be recognized during the holiday season, but without upsetting anyone or risking liability on the part of the company? And maybe just so you don't have to fight over it. Lisa, would you like to go first?
Okay, sure. I mean, it is a complicated time of year because it's a very happy and festive time of year, but yet it is a time where emotions are high. People are stressed. They're shopping for holidays. They've got family coming in. So emotions are running high, and at the same time, companies want to help employees celebrate. So it's a matter of balancing, like you mentioned, the inclusive piece. Not everybody is celebrating the same holiday, and not everybody is celebrating the holidays in the same way. So we want to be inclusive and make everybody feel like they're a part of the celebration without offending people. I sort of understand your point as well about the political correctness, and sometimes it feels like we might go too far. So what is the balance there? So making sure you're respectful, doing your best to communicate clearly with employees, and watch your language and watch the tone of your messaging to make sure that it sounds like you're including everybody. And then the second piece, as you mentioned, was the liability and thinking things through before just jumping on an idea, making sure you've thought of all of the potential, like you called them, the potential fails that might occur, and try to address that before it happens.
That's really helpful, Lisa. And it's interesting you mentioned, watch your tone, because it's been interesting. I've seen, we've talked about political correctness, inclusivity, which is really important. There has been a backlash, and people often talk about what they perceive as an attack on Christmas. And I've actually heard people say Merry Christmas in such an aggressive tone because it's almost like a political statement that they're not going to be restricted. So you got to be mindful about things like that. And also, I think back to the spirit in which these things should be intended. So,
Right.
Brian, what about you? What are your sort of overall thoughts or top tips?
It's I think that in many ways this time of the year is the best and brings the best and the worst of human behavior out. I suppose there are some workplaces where banning Christmas parties or holiday parties might make some sense, but to me, it's the last resort. The holidays, I think, provide a great opportunity to reinforce camaraderie and build teamwork within a workplace. And there aren't many times of the year when we do bring people together with a happy spirit. So, to me, it's a shame to reduce the amount of celebration. But at the same time, it's really important to provide the right context and staging for those kind of celebrations. And the kind of things that I think are most successful are when I speak of staging, what I mean is think through the event, think through how it's going to occur, what the risks could be. Make sure you identify an official host, somebody ideally from management or who has some level of seniority in the organization who will monitor the event and build in some course corrections where needed. Because it's the opportunity, I hate to say it, a small minority of people will use it as an opportunity to say, okay, here's my chance to let loose. And in some cases, they forget you're going to need to return to the workplace after Christmas or after New Year's. And that can, provide a great deal of awkwardness that destroys all the teamwork that you were trying to build through the process. So putting the right staging around it, the right boundaries around it is really, really important.
Right. I think people have to remember that even though you may have a holiday party and it may be at an offsite location, it's still a workplace event. And you're still going to have to, as you said, you're going to see all these people, deal with all these people that might be your boss. And yeah, you got to be careful from an employee perspective, from an employer perspective. Setting the tone is really important. And it's funny, you said staging, and the first thought that came to my mind was the inclusivity fails. And I'm sure you guys have seen this as well, where I've heard stories of quote unquote holiday parties where, and people are invited with their spouses, significant others, and children, and they show up to something that is decorated in all like green and white, and there is Christmas music playing, and Santa's at the door, and there are Christmas carols, as I said. There's Christmas decorations. Santa brings Christmas presents for the kids, and there's not a mention of any other holiday. So really, it was a Christmas party, and you may as well just call it that. And sometimes when I've spoken with clients and they've asked me, or I've made the point that they should make sure that their holiday party is inclusive, and they've said, well, we don't know how to do that. We know we've always had a Christmas party. We know how to do that. How do we acknowledge Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or anything else? And what I usually say to them is, just ask. You don't need to ask your lawyer about that. Ask the people involved as to what they would like to see in a party that would recognize their traditions. But I'm curious to hear both of you, because I've had people say, well, I'm scared to ask. So what's been your experience in terms of dealing with that issue?
I think, oh, sorry, Brian. I was going to say, I think that one of the things, I think you're right. People are afraid to ask. They're afraid to touch anything that might offend someone. So one of the things that I tend to recommend is, if it's a holiday party and you want to be inclusive, then one of the ways you might think about that is how do you celebrate festivities without necessarily making it about a religious event? So how do you decorate in a way that is inclusive to all faiths and might recognize all faiths? Are there symbols of the holiday that you could include? So a snowman versus Santa Claus, for example. So things like that, where the religion isn't what the center point of the event is. It's really an opportunity to share an enjoyable experience and a celebration of a holiday season. So how can we do that in a way that's not focusing on a religious aspect of the holiday?
I very much agree, Lisa. And to me, the key, as you state, is to get input from individuals, but do it ahead of the party, do it discreetly, provide an opportunity for people to provide input if they want to, or not to in other cases. I've seen this in one case backfire a little bit when with all the best of intentions, and this was an HR group, so you would think people would be sensitive to these items, but these issues. But what happened in this circumstance was, with all the best of intentions, people were very overt in having symbols from different religions and so on at the event, and then almost to the point of calling out individuals, of saying, well, we've done this for those two individuals. It backfires and creates a level of awkwardness for the individuals who are attending the event, because then they feel that they have to respond in some way to the fact that those symbols were included just for them. One of the things I found works the best is, in addition to having some seasonal symbols and representations, to do something that, frankly, everyone from every background can appreciate. And the one that resonates the most for me is have some kind of charitable involvement, because everyone from every background can relate to that. In some cases I've been involved, we've actually gone out and delivered gifts, to homeless people, or delivered gifts to disadvantaged children. I know, Stuart, you had an event I saw recently where you did something similar in a food bank context with your team. Those are great ways to build you might say, a festive spirit without relating to one specific religion. And frankly, what you're doing is bringing something forward that every religion can relate to.
I've had my own negative experience with that. So it's, I had a situation where they chose the wrong charity, and there was a religious affiliation with the charity. And so there were still people who were offended by the choice of charity. So again, getting consensus in some way, if it's possible. Of course, it depends on the size of the organization. I think it's important to remember that we are trying to make as many people and if at all possible, everybody happy, but it is very difficult to make everybody happy all of the time. So again, back to the respect and communication, and perhaps to your point, if you have a team, or if you can set up a committee that's made up of people from a variety of departments, from a variety of backgrounds, that demonstrate the multinational, multicultural aspect of the organization and have input into the party, that might be a great way of trying to incorporate some of those different ideas.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great point, Lisa. I mean, you've got to do your research. And I heard a similar story where an organization was going to volunteer, and I won't name the organization, but some people in their company said, well, that organization is particularly anti-LGBTQ. So they were offended. They didn't want to be involved in that. And no one had even given that a second thought. And Brian, to your point, as you were talking, I was thinking, we closed our office last Friday afternoon, and all of us went to 360 Kids, which is a phenomenal organization in York region, which helps youth at risk, homeless youth. And so we went there, we prepared a holiday meal, we helped them sort donations, and it's the third year in a row we've done it. And what's been really cool for me, when I first suggested it to the team here, I thought they probably said, okay, mostly because it meant an afternoon away from work. But the reality is they love it. And, when we talked about, well, can we, or should we do it again this year? People were kind of shocked that we even consider not doing it. People really enjoy the experience of going, giving back to the community around the holiday season. It's not religion specific, but it was very meaningful. And we had a holiday lunch as well. But Brian, I thought that was a great point. As long as, as you said, Lisa, you do it properly and do your research. One thing that I had a client experience, I guess it's about 3 years ago now, was they were, they always had a Christmas lunch. And so they understood that was not the way to do things in 2000, I guess it was around 17. So they said, we're going to have a holiday lunch. And it was a fairly multicultural organization. So they did their best to be inclusive, and they did everything that Brian, you were saying. But they had one person who came to HR, I think the day before, and said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe that this is a holiday season. So I'd prefer not to go. Have you guys had to deal with anything like that?
I can't say I've had to deal with that specifically, but there always seems to be an exception. There's always someone who takes exception to something, whether it's during the holiday season or just in general. People, you never know what might offend somebody. I know a senior leader in an organization currently who is very offended by calling the holiday party a holiday party. He wants to call it a Christmas party. Mm-hmm. So it's very, very difficult. Nobody is obligated to participate. I mean, I guess that could be part of the communication. If for any reason this, you don't feel that this is meaningful to you, or you don't want to be involved, I mean, that's an option. It's not mandatory. But you do want to, the whole point is to be inclusive.
Here's one question. You're saying it's not mandatory, but I do recall hearing this issue once where there was a holiday party, and if someone said, well, I don't want to go, then the answer was, that's fine. You certainly don't have to go, but you're expected to be at work. So was that almost a punishment for not going? And I guess, and Brian, have you had to handle similar issues?
Yeah, I mean, not precisely the one you're describing, although one thing I have found that some people are a little adverse to a long event. So, I mean, one way to deal with this may be to have a shorter, event of some kind where everyone attends. It might even be in the office, where you let's say you bring in cookies or share cookies or that coffee, that kind of thing, and then you go out for a lunch. So for individuals who might not want to attend the full event, there's still some opportunity for team building and camaraderie in the office, and they would be expected to attend that. In many HR groups I've been leading, you do have a continued service requirement. So in some cases, you can use that as an opportunity to say, okay, if a certain person doesn't want to attend the event, they can join the coffee part, and then they'll go back and be the I hate to say it, the only person left in the HR office in case an emergency or something happens that people need immediate help. So I think you can use those kind of opportunities as a way to address people's concerns. But a lot of this comes from listening to people, and frankly, we're not always going to get it right. No matter what you do in these circumstances, people are human beings, and they're going to react differently, and you just have to be aware of that and deal with it sensitively, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It was a point I was going to come back to, which it all comes down to communication. And it's amazing how, at least as you said at the opening, emotions are high this time of year, stress is high. But it's interesting that there is this real backlash and people get their backs up sometimes. But I find in most cases, it's all about communication. And I often use the example of my own family. I don't only work in a multicultural organization, I have a multicultural family. And when our kids were very young, so I'm Jewish, my kids are Jewish, my wife is Anglican, and we made it very clear to them that the same way that my wife celebrates the Jewish holidays with us, we celebrate her holidays with her, and we all make it a family thing, and we explained what the different meanings were, and we've developed some awesome traditions of our own, and I know Mark, who I guess is in the background here watching this, has seen this on Facebook. One of the things I love is, I'm not even sure how this happened, but I guess one year we were decorating the Christmas tree, and I always like to put on music, of course, and so I ended up putting some Hanukkah music on. It was actually some swing jazz Hanukkah music, which is really cool. And that has somehow become the tradition, because this year I put on Christmas carols while I was putting up the Christmas tree, which seemed like a logical thing to do, and got flack from my kids who said, that's not what we do in this family. We listen to Hanukkah music when we put up the Christmas tree. So the point is, they are, they're growing up in a multicultural family. They are very receptive. They are very open. But it all came from that initial dialogue of explaining why there are people in our family with different backgrounds, and there's no reason you can't do the same thing within an organization. And as Lisa, as you've said a few times, there's always going to be a few people, but for the most part, I think people are going to be pretty understanding. The flip side, and I had this conversation with a company recently, and they were located in Northern Ontario, and the owner, who'd become a client recently, said, my understanding is we can't have a Christmas party anymore. And I pushed back and I said, well, why not? And he said, well, I think we're supposed to be inclusive, and that could be a human rights issue. I said, okay, well, I have a pretty good sense of the population of where you live. Is there anybody in your 20-person organization that doesn't celebrate Christmas? And he said, no, they all celebrate Christmas. I said, okay, then you should have a Christmas party. You don't have to be inclusive or politically correct just for the sake of being politically correct. It's only to acknowledge and respect the people in your workplace. That was an important point that came out of that discussion.
It's an interesting point as well. Although I wonder what would happen if the following year, there was somebody who did celebrate a different holiday and then all of a sudden puts a twist in their tradition.
Yeah.
I know I have clients like that too, where it's primarily, a Christmas celebrating employee base, but when there has been one or two people recently who don't celebrate, even if they're just temporary staff, it kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. So then the question gets raised again. But it could be an annual decision, right? So you can decide year by year what the workforce looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the risk there, I think you're right, is, so it was always a Christmas party and this year it's a holiday party. Well, why is that? And you don't want
Right.
that person to feel uncomfortable. So that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So, and as I said to you guys before we started, time does fly by. So we've kind of alluded to holiday parties. I almost said Christmas party. We've alluded to holiday parties a few times, but I mean, they can be great. And Brian, you said it can be great for collegiality and camaraderie and just giving people a chance to relax and spend time with their colleagues in a very different context. But especially if they are off-site, if there's alcohol, we now have legalized cannabis, so you might have cannabis at your party. There's all kinds of risks. So maybe I'll Brian, if you want to go ahead, I mean, what do you usually do in terms of trying to mitigate those risks?
I think a lot of it starts with knowing your population. And if you've had experience with the particular group, then that will give you some guidance as to what level of risk you have. I was at a board meeting and a reception last week that had an open bar. There were 30 or 40 people there. The organization, and I wasn't organizing it, so I was a little concerned at the beginning of this, just because you don't see that often these days. But the organizers knew the group, they knew the individuals involved, and knew that the risk was, and they did a reminder at the beginning, but the risk was relatively low. Generally, I wouldn't recommend an open bar. I think a ticket-based approach to drinks makes sense. Give people a couple of tickets. That way they can, decide to have a couple of drinks or not, but it does provide some limits to it. Again, having someone there who is the designated host is really important, and making sure that person understands the organization's policies, understands in general the legal aspects of this, particularly around drinking and driving, and understands the importance of mitigating risk and taking action where necessary. That action may be, working with the bartender to avoid serving shots, for example. It may be calling a time limit to the amount of time when the bar is serving alcohol. It may be ensuring food is brought out relatively early in the process. It's all common sense things that can help address the potential risks associated with alcohol in the workplace. The other concern I've seen, and particularly at the holiday period, is often you're bringing people together who may not always come together. And I'm thinking particularly, often you'll be invited to a supplier event or a customer event. Right. The rules and standards in those organizations may be different. Having said that, for an individual attending that event, they're covered by their own organization's policies and standards, and of course by legal standards. But when people are going out to those kind of outside events, it's often important to speak to the individuals going. And in some cases, we've even gone to the point of alerting suppliers and customers to what our policies are if they're inviting our employees to attend it, because then they're at least called to task if an event does occur. And I've seen those occur in those circumstances where an organization may be a smaller organization, it may have different standards, and that can become a real source for a problem. So those are a couple of the things that I've seen to do, putting some boundaries around it in terms of who's organizing, who's hosting the event, and how much alcohol is served along with food and in what time period.
Yeah, those are some great points. And you're right, the third party can be quite complicated. The other thing that I've seen happen is, you have the official party and then the after party. And I think it's really important to make it clear whether or not that is a workplace event. And if so, who's overseeing it? Because you may have exactly what you said, Brian. You may have someone who is in a position of authority who's at the party overseeing drinking, etc. But who's at the after party? And is it, are you liable? And I think, in many cases, there is potential liability. So you need to address not only the main party, but the after party as well.
In that context is to have a clear end to the official party and work with the event, the venue ahead of time to make that facility, that room unavailable. So, I mean, if you're in a restaurant, you may say, sorry, folks, we now need to vacate because they need to set up for their next holiday party. Mm-hmm. What that does is at least removes individuals from the situation. People then disperse. If a few people decide to go to, let's say, a bar or nearby restaurant to continue their celebrations, it becomes much clearer that there's a dividing line between the official event and something they're choosing to do as individuals on their own.
Yeah, that's a great point. Elisa, what about you? Any recommendations?
I'm just thinking, in addition to what Brian said, the concern about liability is real. And what you had mentioned about cannabis today is quite common for sure. So it's not just a matter of how much somebody's had to drink, it's whether they've had something to smoke or if they're impaired in any way, whether it's prescription, medical, or recreational. And you can't always tell. One of the things that I would encourage, and I do encourage my clients to do, is to ensure that safety is a priority. I mean, it's about liability as well, of course, but safety first. And ensuring that all employees have a safe means of getting themselves home, whether that's through taxi chits, whether that's through a designated driver program that's arranged in advance, or carpools. There's services out there that they'll actually come and meet you at a venue, and they will bring two people, and one person will drive the individuals home and one person will follow with a car. So there's all sorts of alternative options to make sure your employees are getting home safely. I wouldn't want to presume somebody isn't impaired just because you didn't see them drink. There may have been other things going on you're not aware of at the holiday party or following. So just keeping that in mind, safety as a priority is something else I'd want to mention.
Yeah. The best suggestion I ever got, which came actually from a client of mine, was that they always invite spouses or significant others to the holiday party. And I remember them saying, it's an added cost, but he said if people will behave or will be on their best behavior when their spouse is there.
That's true. Actually, we haven't really even discussed the other potential liabilities, such as potential for claims for sexual harassment if somebody has a little too much to drink or otherwise impaired and is a bit too flirtatious, or at what point has somebody crossed the line in a holiday party? If you're dancing and they put your hand on your back, is that crossing a line? So there's so much that can happen, and thankfully we have employment lawyers like Stuart who are there to answer some of those questions. But
yes, we should all be thankful for employment lawyers at this time of year.
But we just want to be aware that those are potential scenarios that could come up, and be ready to address them should they come up, and to be preventative as much as possible. Have the conversation in advance, remind people perhaps of your policies, to be responsible, that this is a work event, and then to be safe on the way home.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. And I was going to mention the remind people beforehand of the fact that your policies exist and that they apply to workplace events. I think that's really important. Limiting intoxication is important, and having spouses can act as a bit of a deterrent, which I think is a great approach. And having your employment lawyer is not a bad idea. So you can always invite your employment lawyer to your parties. I'm happy to attend, and even bill at a reduced rate for that type of thing.
I've seen the inviting spouses or partners work very well. The only pushback I've experienced is where you have individuals, and it's true in most families now, where both spouses are working and they may have children, and it becomes quite awkward to, you have to arrange a babysitter, you may have a sick child, so there may be reasons why that then becomes awkward. So you have one individual attending by themselves, whereas, all the rest of the group are there with their spouses. It can become a little bit awkward. I still think it's a useful tactic. You just need to provide some cushion around it for those individuals that, for whatever reason, may not want to bring their partner or may not be able to bring their partner. But the whole point on liability, I just wanted to raise one really quick point. It's really important as you look at these events to remember, if you're in a supervisory role or a leadership role, you're essentially always at work when you're with people that you work with. Because I've seen leaders, supervisors, even senior executives believe that, well, we went out after the Christmas party and went to a bar. That's no longer a workplace event. As a supervisor, you're always in a position of power when you're with employees that are either directly or indirectly reporting to you. That's why I like it when organizations have policies restricting relationships between a boss and his or her employees. And we've seen this in recent cases at McDonald's and other organizations where that's become a major issue. So it's really important, not only with the broader population, to remind people of the harassment issue, but also to be clear with anyone in a supervisory role that they have a particular reason to be cautious about their behavior in this circumstance.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's funny, I've been interviewed a few times recently on that whole issue of workplace romantic relationships or other relationships. And you're right, you can't somehow carve out a portion of your life that's separate. And I mean, I had one case I dealt with many years ago now, and I don't think it was a holiday party. I think they had a summer party. And as the summer party kind of wound down, one of the people in management had about 5 or 6 people with him. And this was before legalization of cannabis, but he brought out his stash and said, I just want to be clear, this is not an official company event anymore. And in his mind, that sort of absolved him of any liability going forward. You can't just sort of turn it on and off. As you said, Brian, if you're a manager, you're a manager. The other thing that's been interesting I've seen, and you guys may have seen it as well, is workplace relationships that have been successfully hidden for most of the year suddenly become very apparent at the holiday party.
That's true. I have seen
that as well.
So I'm curious, I know we always talk about war stories. Either of you want to share a particularly bad or entertaining story you've heard about something that happened at the holidays and can tell us confidentially?
You know, I can think of one, and it was an interesting circumstance because it involved different generations. And I mention that because standards within generations of what they consider acceptable conversation in a social context can be different. In this context, a younger worker was much more open about, in a social context, about her romantic activities and things that were occurring outside of work. A manager, an older, in this case, male manager, interpreted that very differently and interpreted that, well, you know, this person is making an invitation to have a certain kind of conversation. So starts going down that path of having that conversation. And then very quickly, if others are listening, they may view this very, very differently. So that's the kind of circumstance I've seen where, you know, you can't just draw a line and stop a conversation and say it's no longer workplace, as you say. And people are still, even in today's world, not fully cognizant of the risks in that area.
Yeah, and once you throw in alcohol or cannabis, of course, people lose their judgment at times. Lisa, what about you?
You know, there's so many different examples that have come up. I think, you know, I'm trying to think of a good story to tell. I mean, ultimately, a lot of the stories have to do with people misbehaving at a work event or a holiday party or similar, and what that means for them in the long run. I mean, we had started this conversation at one point about saying something like, at the end of this, you're going to have to go back to work. And I sort of jokingly at the time responded, or not, because there have been such violations of company policies at some of these parties that you can't go back to work after what you've done. I think that Brian at one point had mentioned a supplier party, and I know of a particular situation where somebody did something unforgivable at a supplier party. And when they went back to work, that was their last day. I mean, they were let go based on what they had done at that particular party. So you really do need to be careful how you behave, and being under the influence or impaired is not an excuse for bad behavior or inappropriate behavior. You're still a representative of the company in that case where they're at a supplier party, and depending on how far you go, it can have very severe repercussions.
Yeah, it's a great point. And as you were talking, it made me realize or think about how many investigation reports I have read that recount what happened at the company holiday party. It's unbelievable. It might be part of a sequence or over an extended period of time, but so often there's something that happens at the party that really brings things to the fore. And you're right. I mean, it's a great party. It's a great event. It's fun. It's collegial, but it can be the end of your career. We've seen a lot of high-profile cases, so it's critical. And the one thing I do remind our employers, though, is our employer clients, is if something does happen at the party, you know, you should never just fire the person right away. That's almost never the right reaction. You got to take some time. You got to investigate. You got to assess, you know, legal rights, etc., before making that snap decision, because there may be a lot more to the story. So there probably will be an investigation, but you know, you're right. You don't want to be the one who causes the investigation as a result of what you do at the party.
Exactly. And you're right. There have been so many holiday parties that end with several investigations. So let's just try to avoid that.
Yeah, that's probably a good closing message. But anything else you guys want to add as far as tips for the holidays?
You know, your last point, I just wanted to reinforce, Stuart, that, you know, even if an egregious behavior apparently does occur, you need to conduct an investigation. I've seen many senior leaders, you know, move immediately to a termination without an investigation, without understanding what happened at the event, and frankly, what are the circumstances that it, you know, arguably led up to that particular behavior. So it is important to do these things with due diligence.
Yeah, and I mean, look, it applies anytime, and I say this all the time because I've, you know, spent a good part of my career talking about just cause for dismissal and writing a book on it, and I know that it's not just the misconduct in question. You have to take what our courts always call a contextual approach, look at all the relevant circumstances. So you've got to do the investigation and then make your decision. But I guess from an employee perspective, we say it over and over again. You need to remember this is a workplace event, and what you do at the party can come back to haunt you. It's not like Vegas. So I think that's a really important message for people to remember. All right, I think it's already 1:07, so I guess we're pretty well out of time. But Brian and Lisa, I want to thank you. You've both been great. I've kind of enjoyed having two guests. It's a nice change. It's good to get two different perspectives. You both bring a wealth of information. So first of all, for anybody who wants more information about Lisa or Brian, Lisa is, her firm is Peak Performance HR, which is at www.peakperformancehr.ca. And Brian is Brian Daly and Associates, which is www.briandaly.org. So I encourage everyone to check them out online and connect with them. And thank you guys both so much for joining me today. It was a great discussion.
Thank you, Stuart. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Rob, I guess now is my chance to fire away. Okay, so in season 2, episode 11 of Fire Away, I'm still wearing my holiday hat because it was a focus on holidays in the workplace, which I could spend probably 2 hours talking about. But what I want to talk about today in my brief opportunity to fire away is the fact that we often refer to the holiday season as the most wonderful time of the year, and it can be great. It's a great time to have fun with your colleagues, to relax. It should be filled with good cheer and goodwill, and yet the holidays in the workplace bring with them a whole lot of complications and controversies. Start with a very basic question. We talked about this in season 2, episode 11, where I had Brian Daly and Lisa Kay join me. What do you even call this time of year? Historically, it was Christmas, and the kids had a Christmas break from school, and you walked through the mall listening to Christmas carols, and Santa came and brought gifts. Now, in the age of inclusivity and political correctness, it's supposed to be the holidays, although of course we now get a backlash from people who think that's just a politically correct way of saying Christmas, and people get their backs up about that. We can't even agree on what to call this time of year. And then of course you have to acknowledge the fact that in the workplace, it depends where you are, but in most cases you will have a multicultural workforce comprised of people of different backgrounds, and it's important to respect and acknowledge those backgrounds. And I know personally, I will not be offended if someone wishes me a Merry Christmas if they don't know what holiday I celebrate. But it also occurs to me that particularly in a multicultural city like Toronto, it is a little ethnocentric to assume that everyone celebrates the same holiday that you do. So I encourage our employer clients to make sure that they acknowledge and respect all the different backgrounds and traditions in their workplace, and the same way that we do at home. And in my home in particular, not only do I have a multicultural workforce, I have a multicultural family, and we acknowledge and respect different backgrounds. And it's made for a really fun holiday season because we often combine Christmas and Hanukkah in our case. And it's not only respectful, it's actually enjoyable to acknowledge both. And that's one of the important points that I often make to our clients, is that people get frustrated by this notion that and at the same time, when there is a Christmas party, you may have a small segment of your workforce that basically feel like second-class citizens because their holidays are not acknowledged or respected. And just to make matters worse, they don't have statutory holidays. So if they want to take time off to observe their holidays, they have to ask for vacation days or other ways time off. And there is a resentment there because they look at their Christian colleagues who automatically have Christmas Day and usually Boxing Day as well as Easter Day. So there's an issue there as well. I've seen lots of efforts to promote inclusiveness that have failed. I've seen quote unquote holiday parties where you arrive and you have Christmas music in the background, Christmas decorations, the kids are doing Christmas crafts, you're served a traditional Christmas meal, and then Santa comes and gives out Christmas gifts to the kids, in which case it really is a Christmas party in all but name. And again, even though you tried to call it a holiday party, you've left your staff, or at least some of them, feeling like second-class citizens. And of course, the worst holiday fail I've ever seen was the Hanukkah ham, which I bought at Walmart. And Rob, I don't know if you have that. There we go. As we often say, and we said this with Lisa and Brian during season 2, episode 11 of Fire Away, if you're going to have an inclusive holiday party, that doesn't just mean acknowledging other parties or other traditions. you should be speaking to your staff, understanding their traditions, understanding what's not a part of their tradition. So Hanukkah ham is obviously not a very good idea to acknowledge a Jewish holiday. So in terms of where do you go from here? What should employers be doing at this holiday time? First of all, promote an inclusive workplace and inclusive workplace celebration. So acknowledge all the different backgrounds in your workplace and don't blindly insist on having a Christmas party just because that's what you've always done. Second point, talk to your staff. If you have people from different backgrounds, don't point them out in front of a large crowd. Don't call them out in front of everyone else, but talk to them politely, respectfully, and privately so you can understand what would make them feel as though their traditions were being acknowledged and respected and incorporated into your holiday traditions. At the same time, don't be inclusive just for the sake of being politically correct. If you work in an area that is entirely mono-denominational, if everyone celebrates Christmas or Hanukkah or Kwanzaa or whatever the case may be, you don't need to acknowledge religions or backgrounds that aren't a part of your organization. So don't do it for the sake of doing it for the sake of being meaningful. But take the opportunity to make this a warm and festive celebration for everyone. Make it inclusive, and make sure that everyone, we talked in season 2, episode 11 about holiday parties. That's a whole other issue, but make sure that you as an organization are not opening yourselves up to liability as you have the holiday party. At the same time, don't scrap it, because frankly, from what I see, and I'm sure from what everyone who's watching, particularly those in HR see, the holiday party is one of the very few times where people in your workplace might have the opportunity to socialize, to engage in an environment that is totally different than the day-to-day workplace. So it's a great opportunity that shouldn't be gotten rid of, but it should be adapted to today's reality. And the last challenge I'll mention, and I'll end with a question. I've talked about what employers should do to make it inclusive. The bigger question that I've talked about in the media and in print is what should the government be doing? And specifically, consider the fact that in every jurisdiction in Canada, we have statutory holidays that are based upon Christian holidays. In other words, Christmas and Easter, and then perhaps Boxing Day, I suppose you could argue. Consider the fact that all of our human rights legislation says that sorry, I lost my notes there. All of our human rights legislation says that there should be no differential treatment on the basis of religion. So why is it that one religious group has 2 of its holidays statutorily protected and no other religious group does? I think the reality is, the answer as to why is because that's the way it's always been. And if we were going to design a system now, we probably wouldn't have statutory holidays based upon Christmas and Easter. But that's what we have. That's the situation that exists. The reality is that everyone should have an equal opportunity to observe their holidays. So how do we fix this issue? One option is to replace Christmas Day and Easter with 2 floating holidays, but there are problems with that as well, and I've talked about that in other contexts. I won't get into it now. So I'll end with a question, which is with an invitation, I suppose. If you have suggestions for how to remedy this situation, then feel free to email me and let me know, because I would love to hear them, because I think this will be a discussion we'll be having more and more going forward. But I will end by saying that in the meantime, no matter how you celebrate or what you celebrate, I hope that everyone enjoys a joyful and relaxing holiday season with their family and their friends. And I want to wish everyone a very happy and healthy New Year. And with that said, I will remove my hat because it's getting extremely hot in here. And I will conclude my rant for this month. That's my 2 cents worth, and you got it here for free. That's all the time we have for season 2, episode 11 of Fire Away, the holiday edition. I've now removed my hat, but it's still the holiday edition. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you in particular for Brian Daly and Lisa Kay for joining me for a great conversation. Our next episode will be on Tuesday, January 21st. That's our first episode of 2020. If you have any questions, feel free to email us at info@rudnerlaw.ca. Past episodes can always be found on YouTube, on our website, and on Facebook. And if you like or subscribe to our pages or channels, you'll get notifications. I will invite you to keep in touch with Rudner Law throughout the month, not just for Fire Away. Sign up for our newsletter to find out everything that's going on, as well as getting employment law updates throughout the month. But, and I say this every month, please remember that none of this, the show, the blog, the newsletter, etc., none of this replaces legal advice. If you think that you might need an employment lawyer, you probably do. So please feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to help you if we can. Thank you to Rob, to Rebecca, and to Mark for helping to put the show together as always. And I wish all of you very happy holidays, and wish everyone again very happy holidays, whatever you celebrate. All the best for a happy and healthy new year. And thanks again for tuning in.